Welcome to Conversations from St. Norbert College, a program that invites you into discussions taking place in your community on today's local and global issues. Now, your host for Conversations from St. Norbert College, the Dean and Academic Vice President of the college, Michael Marsden.
Good evening. My name is Michael Marsden, and I'm your host for this edition of Conversations from St. Norbert College. Our special guest this evening is Mr. David Cay Johnston, Pulitzer Prize winner and one of America's top investigative reporters, specializing in economic issues. Mr. Johnston received the Pulitzer Prize for beat reporting in 2001. Until April 2008, he had been the tax reporter with the New York Times for 13 years. Mr. Johnston is currently busy as an author, reporter, radio and television essayist, and lecturer. His latest book is entitled Free Lunch: How the Wealthiest Americans Enrich Themselves at the Government's Expense and Stick You with the Bill. It describes how government policies subtly take from the masses and enrich the rich. His last bestseller, Perfectly Legal: The Covert Campaign and Rig Our Tax System to Benefit the Super Rich and Cheat Everybody Else, was chosen as the Book of the Year in 2004 and is used across the nation at universities and colleges. Our topic this evening is the importance of good investigative reporting. Welcome to our program. We're really pleased to have you with us.
Thank you for having me here, Dean Marsden.
I wanted to ask you, given your impressive career, would you talk a little bit about why you think investigative reporting is important, maybe even more now than ever, particularly for a democracy?
Well, without investigative reporters who are in the business of looking at things that are and explaining them where they are not as they appear to be, people believe something. Surface. That's right. Go below the surface. And when I find, or any of my peers find something that is as it appears to be, we're bored. It's when we find things that aren't as they appear to be. And the most important areas to do this deal with policies. They don't deal with individual corruption. They deal with the rules that shape our democracy.
Such as the tax codes.
In particular, where I've worked in recent years in the tax code, but I've worked on lots of other things over the years. But rules, everything has rules. You know, people think we live in a society with deregulation.
Which we don't.
No, there's only new regulation. And to understand how thoroughly rules permeate society, baseball regulates how many stitches are on the baseball. Trivial activity, but it has rules. So finding out where those rules are not producing the supposed results.
Right.
Is very important if you want to remain free and maintain the liberties of the people and the economy that we have.
That's very interesting. Now, you have a long and distinguished career in journalism, which, according to your resume, you began with the San Jose Mercury News. Along the way, you worked with the Detroit Free Press, Los Angeles Times, Philadelphia Inquirer, and the New York Times. Among all those newspapers, what did you find to be perhaps the most exciting working environment of all those opportunities you've had?
Well, the most fun was at the Detroit Free Press, because I left California and went there and dragged 5 little children there because we were in a newspaper war, the last great newspaper war.
Yes, I remember
and
that. Yeah.
There was tremendous pressure to get very important stories and to get them in the paper, and a lot of things happened as a result of that. But the best work, hands down, was at the New York Times. There is no news organization, and everybody in the news business knows this, of the quality and caliber and commitment of the New York Times. Flaws and all, it is an extraordinary place.
And you were there for 13 years at the Times. Now, talk a little bit about how much freedom you had, particularly at the Times, to do whatever story you wanted to do. Talk about how you would pick a story and how you would get it screened, whatever you have to go, what process you have to go through.
Well, with apologies to Mark Twain, there are two kinds of reporters. There are reporters who get a note in their typewriter telling them what to do, which tells you how far back I started.
Right.
And there are those who tell editors what they're going to do. And I've always regarded myself as a small businessman. I get a retainer called a salary, and I sell to editors what I want to do, and they say yes or no. And that's probably 95% of my time over the last 40 years was spent that way. At the New York Times, the only constriction was that I worked for the business desk. Okay. And so I had chosen not to work at the Washington Bureau because I thought Washington is better covered away from Washington by covering the flow of paperwork from the government rather than what politicians say. What politicians do, not what politicians say, was my area. And so except for the fact that I didn't go write very much about, arts or other fields, I didn't have any restrictions on me at all. And until about the time that I left, newspapers had plenty of money. I mean, I often spent tens of thousands of dollars of the paper's money certainly the LA Times, the Philadelphia Inquirer, and the New York Times, on a single story on research. But that's coming to an end because the economic model is falling apart.
Surely, yeah. It is difficult. Now, in 2001, you won the Pulitzer Prize for your reporting on loopholes and inequities in the U.S. tax code. What made you decide to go after that? That's a huge topic.
Well, I didn't think anybody was covering taxes well. And in 1986, when I was at the Los Angeles Times, I was riding in a car when President Reagan was on radio signing the 1986 Tax Act. And I had two thoughts. And one was, if my father, who was a disabled veteran of World War II, were still alive, he'd be proud of me because I'd be paying taxes at the same rate as the Rockefellers. And the second thought I had was, why is all the news coverage about the top rate coming down? Mm-hmm. People like me, working people, we're not getting any benefit out of this. Right. And I began looking around and writing about some estate taxes, where wealthy people were diverting money that was supposed to go to poor children in one case, and other causes to their own pockets, and exposing this and bringing about some stopping of this. And then I went to the Philadelphia Inquirer, which at that point there had been 3 Pulitzer Prizes for covering taxes, all won by the Philadelphia Inquirer.
Interesting.
And when the editor of the Inquirer became the managing editor of the New York Times, he had come from the New York Times and he went back, he brought me with him, and our idea was to do a running investigation of how does the tax system really work, not the nonsense you hear every day on the television, but how does it actually work?
Interesting. And that's what got you involved in that. And then that must have been a proud moment for you, though, to receive the Pulitzer.
Oh, it was. It was. I had worked a long time for that. I was a finalist 3 other times around that period for my revealing stuff about the tax code. Congress passed a lot of laws. Some people went to jail. A couple of people lost their jobs.
Yeah.
And a number of laws were passed to address some of the inequities that I exposed.
You've taken on some other challenges, and I think these are interesting. Tracking down a killer in Los Angeles that the police were unable to find, misuse of charitable funds by the United Way, etc. These are just a few of the topics, but you've had very positive results with these. But again, how do you decide? I mean, of all the topics in the world, is it just what interests you and you have a passion for?
Well, there are always more stories than you can do, just like there are always more fish than you can catch. And so what matters is picking those things that are significant and that tell you something about your society. So in the case of the young man who had been tried 5 times for a murder, I wrote the first substantial story in this country about what's known as a drive-by gang shooting. And that led to a prosecutor telling me about this horrendous racially motivated murder case.
In L.A.
Covered by the L.A. County Sheriff's Department. And this young man who was tried 4 times, mistrial, conviction, and then the judge threw it out, and the judge actually used the word technicality. So I went into this thinking, this is a horrendous case of misjustice. I eventually, at the very end, just as I was about to turn the story in, met the young man who broke down in tears in front of me. And I went, wait a minute, cold-blooded, racially motivated gang leaders don't behave this way. Right. Dragged out of this young man 3 facts, within an hour established they were true, and realized that the detective in the case, the only murder case he ever handled, unable to find the real killer, had framed this kid. And I went and found the real killer, confronted him. Probably the stupidest, most dangerous thing I ever did in my life.
I was going to ask you about
He got up at one point and announced he needed to get something in the bedroom, and I had visions of a very large gun, so I followed him into the bedroom. And eventually it was a 5th trial, and the young man was acquitted. In fact, the jurors were astonished that they had sat through this case because the real killer was called as a witness, and all sorts of evidence that had disappeared suddenly was brought forward by some honest guys in the sheriff's department. That was a very important story because it went to this issue we now know a lot about in this country, that we have executed people who are pretty clearly innocent. We have released numerous people from prison on DNA evidence. And when the police frame an innocent person because of the public pressure to get
somebody for it,
the worst thing that happens isn't the innocent person going to prison, awful as that is and much as that builds disrespect. It's that the predator is still out there committing
other
crimes.
Yes. Very, very serious. Then that must have been, again, another quite satisfying conclusion for you ultimately. Have you had any stories that you have worked on that didn't end so happily, that you sort of had to abandon for whatever reason?
Oh, sure. I mean, once I'd been at this for maybe 7 or 10 years, within 2 or 3 days you could figure out whether this was not either worth the time or for various reasons it wasn't going to work at all as a story. And I'm very unusual among my peers in that there are stories I have done that I've hung on to for 10 years. Some of them I've carried across newspapers to stick with them. But yeah, you make choices, and you're judged, and your career is based on whether you go after big game or you take a howitzer to go after gnats.
Exactly. But along the way, have you had any threats?
Oh, sure. I mean, there are places on the internet where people have promised that come the revolution, I'm the first person who will swing, and which tells me a lot about how incompetent they would be as revolutionaries. They have no idea who the right targets are. But sure, and most of them are inconsequential. I've had a few that I thought were very serious, and my view is you do what you have to do, and if something happens, you can't do anything about that. If you cannot act out of fear. That's one of the things I troubles me with my fellow Americans. The day of 9/11, I said to the 7th of my 8 children who was in high school, we are not changing our lives. That is the purpose of this evil stunt. It has no military significance whatsoever, but it is designed to intimidate and to change us and to take us back to a world that people fought and died to get out of. And we will not be afraid. We're going to go to Europe. We're going to fly in airplanes. We're going to conduct our lives the way we choose to. And if something happens, life is not without risks. And to my amazement, all these polls show people who are in fear and cowering. Yes. And it's shameful that Americans are behaving this way and that they've been manipulated this way.
In effect, the terrorists win.
That's exactly right.
Exactly. Now, one particular investigative story that you spent a lot of time on was, and I found this absolutely fascinating, that you determined that the junk bond kings had actually taken over the casino industry in this country from the mob. Yeah. Now, boy, talk about that. I mean, that's a story that I had not heard before.
Well, I had written on and off about the casino industry for years, and my mentor had written a book about this, Wallace Turner of the New York Times. And I went to Atlantic City in 1988 to cover the casino industry, and my thought was, well, here is an industry traditionally controlled by vice lords that is being legitimized. And how has government done at this? Everything says they've been successful at it. And I was astonished at what I proceeded to find. But the first mechanism was that the state of New Jersey set up a system to insulate the casino owners from the mob, to protect them, to put them inside a casing. And the people who took advantage of this, first and foremost, were people connected to 2 businesses, the Holiday Inn and Ramada Inn chains, where they couldn't expand anymore because the interstate highway system was finished.
But
and
they
had
had
gotten into the gambling.
Money.
They had lots of cash, and they went into the gambling business. And then Mike Milken, the junk bond king, who effectively, injected money onto these balance sheets of companies that had no money and addicted them to it the same way a heroin dealer does. And some of them were very successful, and some were not with these deals. And so you had a whole new group of owners come. And the gambling industry, I predicted then, would change, that it would spread across the country. And in my first book, Temples of Chance, I named the states where I thought it would go and hit it right on the head as to which states it was. And this spread of the casino industry, I thought, reflected 2 things. First of all, lots of people want to gamble. So I believe the state has a legitimate interest in providing them with a safe, honest place to gamble. I did prove that one of the casinos in Atlantic City owned by Donald Trump was cheating customers.
Really?
Which the state tried very hard to not do anything about in terms of fining him, just stopping the cheating. And secondly, the state shouldn't be in the business of encouraging credit gambling, where people sign markers and borrow money, which has been shown to have led to numerous crimes of embezzlement and impoverishing. Sure. People had tens of millions of dollars being completely broken. That strikes me as a very troublesome area. And I also ended up showing how the one of the casinos in Atlantic City was deeply involved with someone from the Medellin drug cartel, and the regulators were, what?
Oh, my goodness, yeah. Now but you're not talking at all about the Native American casino system.
Well, that's a very mixed picture. Some of the Native American casino operations actually have been run by guys who are mob-connected. Some of them have been very well run. And there's a very mixed picture about Indian casinos. My theory in going to Atlantic City to cover the casinos, though, was the U.S. Supreme Court issued a ruling that one of the native peoples was entitled to have a casino. or could be under the law. And I immediately said to myself, well, the history of America is every time the Native Americans get something, the dominant culture takes it away from them.
Takes it away.
And watch, you're now going to see the spread of gambling because of this decision. It's going to spread all over the country. I'm sure that will happen. And when I told this to an editor at the LA Times, he looked at me and said, that's ridiculous. There's not going to have gambling all across America. How could anybody possibly believe that? And, of course, the evidence is in.
Yeah. In fact, there seems to be no end in sight.
Yes.
Actually. I just want to remind our viewers that you're watching Conversations from St. Norbert College, and our special guest this evening is David Cay Johnston, a Pulitzer Prize winning author and lecturer. And our topic this evening is the importance of good investigative reporting. You cover a lot of economic issues, yet you're not an economist.
Right.
How does that work?
Well, I've always been interested in the exercise of power, and I have a little saying, what's the point of acquiring power if you can't abuse it? Mm-hmm. And I started studying in college. I got a fellowship to the University of Chicago Graduate School of Economics, but I'm not an economist for sure. And I began to see that the economic rules of our society have a great deal to do with who succeeds and who does not.
Yes.
And I began to see over time, how it was that legal monopolies were incredibly prosperous, far more than they needed to be, and how this was causing damage to people. And then I started looking at the tax system, and my economic knowledge and my knowledge of how businesses work at that point became incredibly valuable in showing that the American tax system doesn't operate as people think that it does.
That's interesting. And so you've just kept mining that.
Yes.
All the way through. I like your idea that if something seems to be what it is and it turns out not to be, that becomes the focal point and move forward. You have been particularly critical about the news media coverage of our $700 billion, almost $1 trillion bailout of Wall Street and associated businesses. Why? Why are you so critical of that?
Well, most of the news that you get is what I call he said journalism. It is an accurate quote of what someone said, in many cases written by reporters who really do not understand at the level of theory and principle what they're writing about. There are lots of very good reporters, but they're a relatively small group. And they tend to work for a handful of the very best organizations, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal. And so when the bailout came, it seemed to me that we needed to keep in mind fundamental principles of markets. You take risks. If you fail, the punishment is you go out of business. That is the discipline that causes you to take smart risks. And what the firms on Wall Street, which are called investment banks, but really are not investment banks anymore, they are derivative trading houses. What they have done is separated risk from responsibility. And they have managed to create a system where you and I bear the risk of their failures. That's not a market economy, that's corporate socialism. And that's what we live in, is corporate socialism. And it will devastate our economy if we don't recognize this and we don't go back to regulation. I teach at the business and law schools at Syracuse University the law of the ancient world and how it affects the world today. We have always regulated banking. It is bizarre that in our time we've thought, well, we'll just let bankers take all of our money and do what they want with it and then not be held accountable for it. And it will bring us to ruin.
Reward them.
Quite literally.
Now, why is it, though, that the news media aren't getting at the heart of the problem? Why aren't they really focusing in on that?
Well, some people are. I mean, Gretchen Morgenson and Eric Dash and Louise Story at the New York Times in particular, and a number of reporters at Bloomberg News, which almost no one reads but is a superb news source, have done a fantastic job of getting at what is actually going on and showing that, for example, when Goldman Sachs was out getting state pension funds to buy certain of its financial products, saying this is a great investment, at the very same moment they were shorting, that is, selling these investments as a bad investment in their own personal accounts, because the law does not require investment bankers and brokerages to have what's called a duty of loyalty or fiduciary duty. Your lawyer is your agent. He has to represent you first and foremost ahead of himself, not the people who take your money to invest it in mutual funds and stocks. And guess what? As a result, those people always make money, and most people do not do well in the stock market and the other markets.
But what about the consumer side of the equation, which is that some of this is certainly fueled by greed? we're not happy with a modest return. We want these extraordinary returns, which then leads to, the various frauds that we know about. But,
greed is part of the human condition. I mean,
yes.
It's the reason it's in all of the religious texts of the world. And usury. We used to put people to death for usury because it was considered a moral offense to steal the time God gave you to produce interest for someone else, as opposed to being paid for your labor. And fundamentally, that's why you have rules and why you have to have regulation. And very little coverage was given to the changes in the regulatory scheme. And even when it was, even if you paid close attention to the news, I'm sure you can remember, and everyone in this audience can remember, all sorts of songs. They play in our heads, right? Mm-hmm. Can you remember a single line from a critic?
No. No, right. Good point. Good point. In addition to being an author, lecturer, etc., you're also on radio and television. Which of the various communication media do you prefer in your career? You've done all of them. Which ones are more satisfying to you?
Well, I've taken a great interest in radio lately, to my surprise. I've been doing a series of short essays called How Did We Get Here? On the economic history of the world. And even though it's radio, I've had people walk up to me in supermarkets and things and ask if I'm that person. And they resonate with people. We watch TV, and some people watch TV to go to sleep. No, people don't listen to the radio to go to sleep.
Oh, you're focused.
They're active listeners. And so I find that to be a really terrific medium as long as you do it in segments of a size and focus that people can get to.
Sort of rediscovering radio.
Yes.
In a way. That's interesting.
Yes, I actually did radio as a teenager, so come back to it.
I guess so. Now, your first book was called Temples of Chance. We talked about that, how America bought out Murder Incorporated to win control of the casino business. It's a long title. Why do you choose these long titles? Your books, I gave a couple of examples.
Well, the short titles are, they're Temples of Chance. That's what a casino is. Free Lunch, it's about subsidies.
Right.
Perfectly Legal is about how the tax system really subsidizes many of the very wealthiest people in this country. The subtitles are designed to, draw you in so that you have some sense of what they are. They're
very clever.
But they're too long, and they're in your face. I mean, one of the criticisms I've gotten is they're very much in your face. So I sat down on the plane one day with a man with one of my books, and the cover shows Uncle Sam holding a guy in a suit upside down, and all of his money's falling out of his pocket.
Myself,
and the money is going into the hands of a plutocrat with a gold cufflink. And this guy begins to doesn't know I'm the author. He just looks at the cover and he says, "Oh, you must be one of those, those people who think such and such." And I said, actually, there's a lot of religious text in this book that talks about Jesus' message and the religion. He says, well, you must belong to one of those churches the communists got into, the Protestant churches that. And I said, excuse me? He says, well, it's not true that Jesus says you have all this duty to the poor. That was just brought, and I thought, holy mackerel. Well, a whole lot of people who actually believe that. They believe a thing called the gospel of prosperity. And they don't know that what is in the New Testament or the Old. They don't know that the Bible repeatedly refers to taking from the poor to give to the rich as evil. Mm-hmm. And yet we have all these laws passed by all these lawmakers that do that. They take from ordinary people, middle class, upper middle class, poor people, to give to rich people, and yet they pose for pictures on the step of their church or their synagogue or their mosque saying they're believers. They clearly are not following what they say they believe.
Well, the gospel of wealth, of course, is very deep in the American psyche, without a question. What kind of a regular writing schedule do you keep? I'm curious. I know that you stepped out of reporting for a few years to write full-length books.
Well, actually, no. I never stopped.
I
never took leaves to do the books. I wrote them. I grew up because my dad was a 100% disabled veteran, relatively poor. Went to work at 10 and full-time at 13. And so, at my age, I know how to work. And I don't keep any set schedule, but I work very heavily. Fortunately, now I work from my home mostly, and actually a much more efficient way to work.
Yes. And
I actually do my writing when the mood strikes me. I do a column every 2 weeks for something called Tax Notes and magazine articles and whatnot. And a good part of my day is spent writing, but there's no set schedule.
What about a book, though? Do you start a book and have just a defined period of time when you're going to try to just focus on that one project?
No, it's one of my shortcomings. I probably would have written a lot more books if I were more focused. I'm a polymath, and I'm interested in lots of different things. And but I do the books pretty quickly. I mean, the last two books were done. The actual writing, it's the reporting that takes time. The actual writing of each of those books took 6 months while still working full time.
Really, that's impressive, though. That's quite an output. You want to talk a little bit about what topics might be on your future agenda?
Sure.
I'd be interested.
I'm doing a book right now called Define Print. I don't know what the subtitle will be. But what I'm going to show is that we have created a privatized redistribution system in this country that puts money up. That instead of letting the market decide things, lobbyists, those 35,000 lobbyists I read about in Washington, have gotten government to put in place all these rules that allow certain industries and businesses to charge way above market prices. In some cases, I pay $180 a month for a triple package that gets me telephone, internet, and cable.
As I do.
The same package is available to people in France for $45 US. And you get a modem that's 10 times faster, you get 5 times as many channels, and you get worldwide telephone calling, not just European calling. Because they have real competition. We think of France, and it's constantly being denounced as sort of this socialist place. Well, guess what? When they decided to introduce market competition and break down their state monopolies on telecommunications, they decided to have competition. We instead, by the actions of Michael Powell, when he was head of the FCC, decided that cable was not a network and was not a common carrier, and therefore there was exclusive rights, and it allows price gouging. And Congress and state legislatures all over the place have done this. And it is one of the reasons that so many people in America are struggling. And yet, if you turn on the CNBC, which is a stock touting business, and if you follow their advice, you'll go broke. There have been several studies showing that. All you hear is about the glories of the market. When, in fact, we have severely restricted markets in this country for many industries.
Interesting. So that's going to be your focal point.
That's the next book I'm doing, and then I'm hoping to do this, turn this radio series and my courses on the ancient world into a book, How Did We Get Here, about the economic history of the world.
In your judgment, are Americans severely limited in their economic understanding?
Oh, incredibly. And let me give you a simple example of that. I tell audiences, where did the idea of democracy come from? Well, some people know it came from ancient Athens, which is correct. But it came from tax policy. It was the invention of the moral basis of progressive taxation, which is 2,500 years old, and I would therefore argue the most conservative principle in Western civilization. That there is no wealth without Athens, and the greater the wealth you manage to attain, the greater your moral duty to support Athens, because it made it possible for you.
For you to be wealthy.
We have completely lost sight of that. We have in this state right now a controversy going on about a candidate for the Senate who has been making multi-million-dollar annual incomes and has paid no taxes on this, income taxes, for 10 years. Well, it's legal for him to do so. That's what my book, Perfectly Legal, explains. That, some rich people pay very heavy taxes. Many live tax-free legally.
Because of the loopholes that you...
And the rules that Congress has set up. And, this is not a progressive system. If you make $50,000 to $75,000 in this country, and I get the Bush administration to agree with what I'm telling you when we did a chart about this in the New York Times. If you make $50,000 to $75,000, your total federal tax burden is equal to that of people who are in the top 400 taxpayers who, the most recent report that came out yesterday, shows made $344 million each in 2007. You pay the same tax rate, $50,000, $75,000 income, third of $1 billion income. If you make $75,000 up to $10 million, you pay a higher burden than these people at the very top. And that's just the 400 highest taxpayers. It's not the 400 highest income people. There are literally people in this country with billion-dollar annual incomes who legally pay no tax. And people do not know this, and they don't understand that it violates the principle that gave birth to democracy. And if you don't pay attention to the principles of a society, your society will eventually fail.
Fascinating. And I think you're right. We have a lot to learn about our economic environment, for sure. I want to thank our special guest, Mr. David Cay Johnston, for sharing his expertise with us this evening. Please join us for future programs as we continue to explore the world of ideas. Until then, I'm Michael Marsden for Conversations from St. Norbert College.